name is Kristen Mari, and I am the chair of the master's program here. And I want to just thank you all for joining us. For those of you that are new, each student is going to be presenting a 10-minute presentation followed by 5 minutes of Q&A. And as I always say, I will prioritize student questions first. So with that, I am going to begin. And I'm going I've been muted this whole time, haven't I?
Just for the last couple sentences.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I just looked and I thought I was muted the whole time. So okay,
Sally,
great.
your hand is still up.
Oh, and Sally, before we do begin, Sally does want to make an important announcement about graduation.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I think that Sylvia, many of you saw the email that Sylvia sent out yesterday. And we have changed our plans for our graduation party slightly. So it's going to be held at noon next Friday, May 20th. So that is a change in time. And it's also, the location is changed to outdoors at the Hamden House patio. So if you could please update your RSVP. We're sorry that we have this last minute change, but we wanted to move the party outdoors to comply with Hopkins rules and the change in rules due to a slight increase in COVID cases on campus. So please look for that email from Cynthia and update your RSVP. You're still welcome to bring guests, and we hope that we have a great outdoor event at lunchtime. There are directions in the email about how to get to the Hamden House courtyard, but if you're still confused, please email me or Sylvia. Thanks.
Great. And hopefully we'll have great weather. That's the other thing. All right. So with that, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Lazarus. She attended University of Pennsylvania with her Bachelor of Arts in Health and Societies and Public Health. And the title of her presentation is called Utilization of Critical Race Theory in Public Health Research. So Elizabeth, yes, you can begin whenever you're ready.
Great. Can everyone see that? Good.
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Meyer, for the introduction. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. So just jumping right into some background information. We all know that racism is deeply entrenched in the United States. And as early as 1899, W.E.B. Du Bois was among the first scholars to identify social conditions were a significant factor of health differences between Black and white individuals. There are well-known historic health injustices that preceded and followed this seminal finding. For example, we have J. Marion Sims, who was named the father of gynecology, who experimented and inflicted harm on enslaved Black women. And we are also aware of the unethical Tuskegee syphilis experiment that lasted about 40 years. Even with these notable injustices, the study of racial health disparities did not materialize until the 1980s. As you can see on the slide, this was first seen with the report of the Secretary's Task Force on Black and Minority Health in 1985. This report was a seminal study by the US government that investigated health disparities. Following this, Dr. Kamara Jones published work that examined the impact of racism on health in 2000. Despite this research and government investment, some disparities have remained prevalent. One example of this is the statistic here shown in bold. From 2009 to 2019, children of color 0 to 17 years of age have had a significantly higher rate of influenza-associated hospitalization compared to white children. You can also see this in the graph. To continue work that will eliminate disparities like this, scholars have used theories and approaches in their research studies. One of these theories is critical race theory. So what is critical race theory, or CRT, and why is it relevant in the field of public health? This theory was founded by a group of scholars in the field of law. Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw might be familiar to you. And they formed this as a way to critically examine the intersection of race, racism, and power in the United States. The main principles of critical race theory are listed here. I'll go through them briefly. So race consciousness describes the recognition of racial dynamics in society. Also, race is defined as a social construct and not a biological one. Contemporary mechanisms relate to the ordinariness of racism And this just means how racism is integrated and normalized within US society. The primacy of racialization describes the social process of classifying individuals into different racial groups. And then we have censoring in the margins, and this is pretty familiar within public health research. This is really just prioritizing the experiences of marginalized individuals. This is often seen with community-based participatory research and qualitative studies. And then lastly, we have praxis, and that's just a focus on critical approaches and actions to not only address, but eliminate health inequities. In 2010, scholars formally introduced the use of critical race theory as a public health methodology. You can see that in this journal article right here. They conceptualized the public health critical race praxis to conduct health equity research with anti-racist methods. It accomplishes this with the application of critical race principles and a critical examination of the context of research studies. As you can see on this diagram on the right, there's 4 focus areas. We have the contemporary patterns of racial relations, knowledge production, conceptualization and measurement, and then action. Underneath focus are critical race theory principles. So the objective of my scoping review was to determine whether critical race theory was explicitly mentioned and applied as a core theoretical framework in public health research. My guiding research questions here are: how has critical race theory been applied in public health contexts? And then what is the significance of its utilization in the context of public health? I chose to focus on this explicit application and include health policy to hone in on critical approaches and action. As there an increase of research covering social determinants of health and also structural racism, it's important to not just name these, but also do work to mitigate and eliminate the inequities that are associated with these determinants. So to conduct this scoping review, I searched these 5 databases here for phrases, critical race, and then titles, abstracts, and full text or keywords. As you can see, my inclusion criteria here as well. So for my inclusion criteria, all the articles had to have the population and data sources confined to the United States. Each article had to have the explicit mention of critical race theory or the public health critical race praxis. And this was confirmed with phrases such as, we apply the public health critical race praxis or critical race theory guided, and this was in the full text. I did not include articles that weren't confined to the United States, and I also excluded thought pieces, commentaries, editorials, and articles where critical race theory was mentioned but not explicitly applied. So the initial sample of my search yielded 398 articles, and then after screening for relevance, I was left with 49. So this slide just gives a little insight into how I managed each article. For each study, I ensured that critical race theory was explicitly mentioned, as I just noted on the method slide, and I also extracted the critical race principles that the authors use in their study. So you can see this is denoted here with the purple circle as well. Moving on to the results section, this bar chart just shows a distribution of the critical race theory principles in each of the 49 articles. As you can see at the top, the public health critical race praxis was applied in almost half of the articles in the sample. And then we have intersectionality, race consciousness, and racializations. And those were the critical race principles that were most often mentioned and applied in public health research. And studies that applied critical race theory also covered a wide range of public health topics. As you can see, women's health, racial health disparities, HIV care, and cancer were the topics that were most seen in the literature. And of the 49 articles in my sample, only 3 discussed health policy implications. This is concerning as a lot of the nation's health organizations are focusing on structural racism and strategies to confront it. For example, last year, the NIH released a plan to confront structural racism. Policy amendment and creation was included in their plan. And this just shows that public health as a field is moving toward addressing systemic racism and its through action. So what does this mean? My findings show that the mention of critical race theory in public health research has increased since 2010. However, less than 13% of the articles in my sample explicitly utilized it. This is congruent with other research studies that have found terms such as institutional and systemic racism were also not as often mentioned in the literature. Further, a recent systematic review found that there was a limited application of the explicit theories in racial health disparities research specifically. This shows that there's a need for more deliberate public health research that addresses this deficiency. Critical race theory and the public health critical race praxis offer a framework to accomplish this through both research and practice avenues. A main limitation of my study is that I did not include articles where CRT was implicitly mentioned or applied as a theoretical framework. I also did not search the gray literature, and I did not use CRT principles as search terms. So for example, I didn't search intersectionality into a Scopus database per se. The main strength of my study, though, is that this is the first review to ever analyze the explicit use of critical race theory in public health research. This contributes greatly to the field of health equity and provides a foundation for not only naming racism and inequities, but also action towards eliminating these health disparities. So next steps. As we can see through the findings, there's an urgent need for public health research that focuses on the explicit application of critical race theory and the impact of racism on health. We can see that health inequities are still very much prevalent today. We've seen the stark disparities in mortality and morbidity associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, this research does not need to end solely at publications and journals, but should also be translated into implementation, initiatives, policies, interventions, and so on and so forth. This review can provide a foundation for the creation of critical race theory-based guides that can inform and facilitate public health intervention, initiatives, and policy. Just want to say a shout out to my primary reader, Dr. Holiday Waru, my cohort, friends, family, everyone who joined the call for me today. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was so interesting and very timely. So I will open it up to questions. And again, I will first look for student questions first. So go ahead and you can feel free to use the chat, or you can raise your hand. And I see Amna. So Amna, why don't you go for it?
Thank you. First of all, Elizabeth, what a wonderful presentation. I have one question for you.
Amna, I don't think we can hear you. Would you mind just speaking up?
Sure, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. My one question is, what are the strengths of the 3 articles that discussed health policy implications?
So those, it was kind of interesting because it was only 3 out of 49. And I thought there would be more considering that those articles were utilizing critical race theory. But for each of them, they had some type of conceptualization of like how critical race theory could be used within policy work. So one specifically created like a critical race theory health policy analysis framework. And that just gave a lot of questions that policy developers or evaluators could use and to really interrogate the policies during creation or development to see if they were actually going to be successful in mitigating or eliminating health disparities. So, yeah.
Great. You also have a question from Morgan, and she says, congratulations, Elizabeth. Why didn't you use the articles outside the United States?
So I could, I'm on mute. But I could have used articles located outside the US. I really wanted to focus on the fact that there's been a lot of investment in research and health disparities research in the United States specifically, but we still see, you know, the prevalence of them today. So that's why I didn't include articles outside of the US. And honestly, even before I decided to focus in on the US, there wasn't that much in terms of critical race theory application in public health. So. Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Mari.
There we go. You'd think by now we would get this, right? But I can take one more question if anybody has it. I'm not seeing anything. So, oh, here we go. Kelsey.
Hi, thank you. That was such a good presentation. I was just wondering if you feel like the rather toxic discourse about critical race theory in the media and in like schools is influencing public health work at all? Just because, yeah, this is such a timely topic.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why I chose on this topic because of the controversy surrounding it. I think that for public health research specifically, I don't know if the media might bring awareness to what critical race theory actually is. I mean, honestly, it's not even utilized or discussed that much in public health, as you can see. It might turn some people off, or it might motivate some people to be a little bit more radical with their work. So we'll see. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you again so much. It was really, really informative. So congratulations. All right, now I would like to welcome Nalina Orprayoon, and she is an MHS candidate, and she has a Doctor of Medicine. She attended, forgive me for trying to pronounce this name, Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. So you can let me know if I was close or not. But Nalina did her residency in OBGYN, and she's had a subspecialty in reproductive medicine. So as you can see here, the title of her presentations is Patterns of Contraceptive Use and Unmet Need in Late Reproductive Age in Southeast Asia. So welcome, Nalina.
Well, thank you, Dr. Marie, for the introductions. It was close. It's Chulalongkorn University. Yeah, and I will continue right to the introduction of my literature review. So, okay, so we know that women's reproductive life spans from menarche to menopause, and most studies use the age of 15 to 49 years old to represent the reproductive age women. And this review will focus on the late reproductive age women, referring to those who age between 35 years old to 49 years old. The cut point of 35 years old was chosen as it is the point when the fertility and the fecundity dramatically decline. However, the ovulation continues to occur until the women reach menopause, meaning that if she's still engaged in the sexual activity, she's still at risk of pregnancy. And the pregnancy that occurs during this period is likely to be unintended and at higher risk of pregnancy complication. So why do I choose Southeast Asia? Actually, major reason is that I'm from Thailand, so which is here in this region. But the interesting of the Southeast Asia is that it's the regions that consists of total of 11 nations that have many diversity in geography, religion, and culture. However, we started to see the similar shift in the population and family pattern demonstrated by the increasing age at marriage, the childbearing postponement, and the preference toward the smaller ideal number of children. And this shift may result in a greater proportion of women needing to use the contraception for delaying, spacing, and limiting pregnancy. And these needs may extend to the later age. From the prospect composition of reproductive age women by the United Nations, as we can see here, there is an increase in the proportion of the reproductive age women in this region. And this underscores the need for understanding the contraceptive practice among this group of women. So the objective of these literature reviews are first, to describe the patterns of contraceptive use characterized by the contraceptive prevalence rate and the method types. Second is to describe the level of the unmet need for contraception. And third is to summarize the determinants and the reasons for contraceptive non-use. Here is the overview of the method. After identifying the research question, I developed a search strategy, and then followed by the identification and selection of relevant study, and finally summarize the result. For the search strategy, I first identify keywords relevant to the three concepts: contraception, measures, and Southeast Asia. For the location keywords, it consisted of Southeast Asia and the name of all 11 countries, naming Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Timor-Leste, and Vietnam. Then I developed the search term for PubMed and Embase. Searching through the Google Scholar and reference list of the retrieve study were also performed. Overall, 7,482 studies were identified through the search strategy. However, only 10 studies were included in the final review after removing the duplicates and screened with the eligibility criteria that is on the right side of this slide. Of these 10 studies, they were studied from Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. And most of them were informative for the patterns of contraceptive and method types. Only one study from Thailand had direct information on unmet needs and their reasons for not using contraceptions. This review also include the report of the national surveys from DHS and MICS, which provided the data on the contraceptive use and the unmet need for contraception in the 9 countries. I need to mention here that I cannot find the study on this topic from Singapore and Brunei, so the following results were not provided the data from these 2 countries. Moving to the results, starting with the patterns of contraceptive use, this graph shows the modern contraceptive prevalence rate among married women aged 35 to 49 years old. The MCPR, or the modern contraceptive prevalence rate, is the percentage of women using modern contraception divided by the number of women in that age group. Here we can see from the light blue bar, indicating that the women within the age group of 35 to 39 years old had the highest MCPR in every country. And the dark bar indicating the women of the oldest group, which aged between 45 to 49 years old, had the lowest percentage in every country, simply meaning that the contraceptive use rate declined as the age increased. Moving to the commonly used methods, we can see here that the short-acting contraception, like birth control pills and injectables, were commonly used method in most countries, except for Vietnam, where the most commonly used method was the intrauterine device. And among the permanent method, female sterilization was more common than male sterilization, and it was among the popular choice for contraception in the Philippines and in Thailand. For the unmet need, data were primarily derived from the national surveys. So overall, we can see the unmet need for the spacing decreased with age, and while the unmet need for limiting increased with age in all the 8 countries with available data. Here we can see Thailand and Vietnam had an unmet need for contraception of less than 10%, thus considered low. But for Timor-Leste, has somewhat different pattern. So they had high percentage of unmet need in the youngest group, and the total unmet need is decreasing with age. Lastly, for the finding for the reasons and determinant for not using contraception, the data is very limited because the study was generally done among all women of reproductive age, and the findings were not really specific to our target population, so I did not include it here. But here we have 2 studies, one from Thailand, which is conducted in women aged over 40 years old, and they found that the reasons for not using contraceptions are the desire to become pregnant and perception of low pregnancy risk, followed by the health concerns. Another finding from Indonesia also reported fertility-related reason, side effects, and health concern as the reason for not using contraception. In conclusion, this review demonstrates the disparities in the contraceptive use among women in the late reproductive years in Southeast Asia. The lowest contraceptive use was reported in the oldest group, for the women aged 45 to 49 years old. The popular contraceptive choice in this population was short-acting contraception, and while the prevalence of the contraceptive use decreased, there was an increase in the unmet need, especially the unmet need for the limiting in the older group. However, the reasons for using or not using contraception in this group cannot be concluded due to the limited data. Our review has highlighted several significant gaps in the research related to the contraceptive practice of reproductive age women. And for the next step, I believe we need more studies to provide a geographic coverage and focus primarily on the target population. Moreover, the study that emphasized on the understanding on the motivations to use or to abstain from contraception would be beneficial for suggesting further public health action. And the policies and programs that would be suggested from this finding would have been to ensuring the reproductive healthcare coverage in reproductive age women as the population and fertility patterns has changed. And it should also include the provision of appropriate contraceptive choices to satisfy the need and the specific health concerns in this population, and more education on contraceptive practice for both women and healthcare provider may help to decrease the unmet need in this population. And this is the end of my presentation. I want to thank my readers, Dr. Linnea and Dr. Celia. Thank you for your guidance and support. Thank you, my advisor and the POPM department. And I would also like to thank my sponsor, King Chulalongkorn Memorial Hospital, Thailand, for giving me the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Great job, Nalina. A very important topic that really doesn't get a lot of attention. So really appreciate this. So let's open it up for questions. Who would like to have a first question to Nalina? Again, let me open up my chat box so you can feel free to use that. Donna, I see your hand.
Yes, thanks. I meant to raise it and then I did a clap, but I wanted to clap both.
I get it.
Nicely done, Nalina. Nalina, so I had a question related to when you talked about sort of the reasons why women didn't use contraception. There was a student many years ago who actually did some work in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I can't remember exactly which country, on this whole issue of not using contraception among older women, because she was very concerned that one of the reasons they didn't use contraception was because they didn't think they were at risk. And I wondered if any of that, if that reason came up in any discussion or any of the work that you looked at.
Yes, so as I mentioned that there was a study in Thailand, but it's likely to it is a facility-based questionnaires that asks women older than 40 years old about like the reason why they're not using the contraception. And one of the reasons that they mentioned is the perception of low pregnancy risk. Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, and actually, Linnea just reminded me that her work was done in Nigeria. And it was really important work because it's clear that women are still at risk at that age group, and the notion that they would not be using contraception because they don't think they're at risk increases the risk of unintended pregnancy. And we know even in the United States that if you look at sort of the two ends of the curve, the youngest and the oldest women, that the highest rates of abortion or abortion ratios are at the two ends of the curve. Thank you. Nice job.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's just a part of my experience as a clinician in Thailand. One of the barrier for women in reproductive age group that to seek the contraception is that it's like a taboo, like in the social norm, that like if she is older, is embarrassed to ask for the contraception. So that would be one of the barrier.
That's interesting. So there's a kind of a stigma associated with it in many ways then.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. David, I see your hand.
That last point, thank you for a very informative presentation. That last point you raised is the question I wanted to ask. Do you see a declining or a declining level of women as they age into that 35 to 49 group, raising issues that are sociocultural or health related that carry over prejudices from 20 and 30 and 40 years ago with respect to contraception, and that this population will ultimately age out to a more informed population who will embrace the use of contraception. It's your point that I really wanted to expand on.
Could you repeat the questions again?
Well, as an example, if you looked at the 25 to 39 age cohort, would you find less issues that seem socioculturally derived than you do at the 35 to 49 age cohort?
Okay.
To give some credence to this notion of a hangover of former patterns that create issues of stigmatization and other such sociocultural issues.
Okay. Yes, I think that could be a reason that why we look at this data from just like the point. So the data was likely to be the descriptive data. So it's like the cross-sectional. So it can represent like these population at this time, but it will be interesting to see the trends as like more women are open, like just as Thai women were more open to talk about like the sexuality. And yeah, I think we can anticipate the change in the trends.
Yes, thank you. You may not have seen Emmy's comment of cohort succession, which is a far simpler way to suggest that. Thank you. It's always good to have smart people
We're
around.
a village, right? We help each, yes. I love it.
Demographers.
Demography teachable moment.
That's great. Thank you, Emmy.
I love it. All right. Well, Nalina, this was wonderful and incredibly informative. So thank you so much. Another round of applause to you. And next up, we have Salma Tayel. She is our MSPH candidate, and she is one of our first, if I believe, BA MSPH students. So I'm so excited for this moment. So because of that, we all know she got her Bachelor's of Arts from Johns Hopkins in public health, but she also majored in natural sciences as well. And the title of her presentation is called Evaluating the Reproductive Autonomy Scale in Egypt, a Qualitative Approach.
Okay, great. Can everyone see my screen? Is it in the right view?
I think we just have to have it in presenter mode.
Oh, is this right?
There we go. Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Dr. Mari, for the wonderful introduction. On that note, I'm just going to dive right into some background that sets the rationale for this study. So for decades, researchers have focused on the impact of women's empowerment on sexual and reproductive health outcomes. And generally speaking, the current state of the literature states that there are indeed relationships between women's empowerment and fertility. And so, for example, empowerment has been found to be inversely related to number of children, an occurrence of an unintended pregnancy, and has been found to have a positive relationship with household decision-making power and longer birth intervals. And so given that women's empowerment is such a complex, multidimensional concept, it makes it extremely difficult to operationalize, and this results in lack of standardization in measurement approaches. And so many studies use different indicators of women's empowerment instead in an attempt to conceptualize it, such as mobility or household decision-making. And this results in inconsistencies in findings across the literature due to the subjectivity of these indicators. And so for this reason, researchers have begun to develop tools that measure specific aspects of matters relating to women's empowerment instead, such as reproductive autonomy. And this is actually where the reproductive autonomy scale comes into play. So the scale, which was developed by Dr. Ushma Ubate and colleagues over at Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health, is the first tool to measure a woman's ability to make reproductive health control matters, to make decisions about different reproductive health control matters, such as contraceptive use, childbearing, timing and spacing of births. And the scale was developed and validated in the United States using a sample of women from different family planning and abortion clinics across the nation. And so it may not necessarily be appropriate or reasonable to directly apply it as it is in context outside of the United States. And it currently has 3 different subscales, the first being decision-making, second being freedom of coercion, and the third being communication. And so the aim of my study was to gain insights about the applicability of the reproductive autonomy tool in Egypt and to assess potential attributes of the scale and reproductive autonomy among women living in different communities across Egypt using a qualitative approach. And so a little bit about Egypt. It is a lower middle income country with a current population of about 100 million. And this number is increasing very rapidly. Its predominant religion is Islam, which actually comes into play when discussing abortion, since it is illegal here. And its current total fertility rate is at about 3.25 births per woman. And its current contraceptive prevalence rate is at about 60%. Fertility is generally higher in rural settings than in urban ones. And generally speaking, women's education levels have been steadily increasing, and so has their participation in the labor force and their age at marriage. And in the 2019 Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Social Institutions and Gender Index report, Egypt actually ranked very high for gender discrimination and inequality, which is really important to consider when exploring something like, or exploring and assessing something like reproductive autonomy in the country. And so the methods of the study involved first interviewing key informants in Egypt on their opinions about the current scale. And this actually allowed for us to remove and revise any current items of the tool which were deemed as not appropriate to discuss in Egypt or not applicable. And this ultimately provided us with a framework for the focus group discussions. And so we did conduct 5 focus group discussions, and they took place across 3 different governorates in both urban and rural areas in Egypt. Our urban areas are the Loa, Arab Ghunaim, and Shobra, which are all in the greater Cairo region, and the rural regions were Shar'iyya and Suhaig. So we then qualitatively analyzed the data collected from the focus group discussions using both an inductive and deductive thematic analysis approach, and we used en vivo to structure the final codebook, which was used to determine the major themes. We had a total of 46 focus group participants. Our eligibility criteria were adult women of reproductive age who had been married for at least 1 year, residing in Egypt, and completed at least intermediate schooling, which we call middle school, due to the nature of the focus group questions. And we underwent purposive sampling by age and geographic area, collaborating with local NGOs and community organizations serving as gatekeepers for recruitment. And we aim to have 8 to 10 women per focus group. And so our focus group discussions resulted in 4 major themes. The first theme was the role of society and perceived religious and cultural values on a woman's ability to communicate about matters relating to sex with her husband. So during our focus group discussions, there were 2 items that were asked relating to being able to communicate about matters relating to sex with their husbands, and participants actually expressed mixed responses. So some were very hesitant and tense when asked these items, and others actually expressed the importance of being able to communicate about these matters with their husbands. And here I have a quote by Angie, a 32-year-old mother from urban Arab Ghunaim, where she highlights her perspective on the importance of actually being able to communicate about these matters, but not actually being able to do so due to religious and sociocultural norms that deem this as taboo or unacceptable. Our second major theme was the role that sociocultural norms and perceived gender roles play in the reproductive decision-making and communication process. Here, I have two quotes that summarize the results for this theme quite well. So starting from the left, we have Noha, a 27-year-old mother of two from urban Ardeloa, expressing her rationale for making her own decisions about matters relating to reproductive health decision-making, because these are decisions that impact her health and her body directly. And then we have Hania on the right, a 31-year-old mother of one from urban Shobra, who shared a very interesting story about how the women and her family back home in a very rural area of Egypt are actually not allowed to use contraceptives because the men in that area have deemed so. We have our third theme. The third major theme was the role that healthcare providers have in shaping women's awareness and ultimately their decisions about fertility and contraception. We found that doctors serve as primary sources of information about family planning and sexual and reproductive health. A quote on the left by Belsam, a 34-year-old mother of two from rural Sharqiyya. She shared her experience on how she tried several different methods of contraceptives with the guidance of her doctor until she found something that worked for her. And interestingly enough, she also expressed how her husband had to approve of what method she had to use. That she ultimately decided to use. And then on the right, we have Abir, a 40-year-old mother of four from rural Sharqiyya, and she shared her experience with not actually being able to have any more children because she reached the quote-unquote maximum amount of C-sections a woman can safely have. And for some context, Egypt is actually one of the top ranking countries in C-section prevalence with a delivery rate of about 52%, and this is extremely high. This is about 3 times over the ideal rate of 15% as recommended by the World Health Organization. Last but not least, many participants also expressed the role that extended family members and community had in their reproductive decision-making processes. We had accounts of them serving, either serving as a barrier or a facilitator to achieving their reproductive intentions and goals. And in the case of Isin, a 35-year-old mother of 3 from rural Sharqiyya, it was actually the latter. So her mother-in-law actually supported her desire to hold off on having children when her husband was pressuring her to have a child immediately after giving birth. And then we have Rudaina's quote on the right, which highlights the pressure that a lot of women experience from their community and family members directly after marriage to have children. We also found that women oftentimes ask trusted family members and friends about their own experiences with contraceptives, and this plays a huge role in shaping their ultimate decisions on what methods to use and what doctors to choose. Okay, so putting it all together, how do these results inform future directions? So we found that most items asked were actually generally accepted and understood by our participants, but some did show hesitancy when it came to items pertaining about their intimate sexual relationships with their husbands. And it is really, really important to consider sociocultural norms when developing measurement tools. We also recommend that the focus of the reproductive autonomy scale be extended to include birth and the birthing decision-making process, since it is very much so currently focused on contraceptive use. This is because of the role that healthcare providers have in the decision-making process here in Egypt, and contraceptive use not even being a reproductive health outcome in some rural areas, as one of our participants had shared. And we also recommend that future studies in this region to view reproductive health decision-making as a process that does not occur exclusively between a woman and her husband. And before I conclude, I just wanted to thank and acknowledge my incredible support system that has made all of this possible. So for those of you who don't know, I have been in Cairo and still am in Cairo on a Fulbright research grant to carry out this work. And so I wanted to thank the Binational Fulbright Committee in Egypt for all of their support and resources. I think May is currently on this call right now, so thank you so much, May, for all of your support. I also wanted to thank Dr. Hassan Zeki at the American University in Cairo. He is also on this call, thank you so much. And Dr. Nahla Abdel Tawab, which is the director of the Population Council here in Egypt, for all of their support and mentorship. Side note, they did both graduate from the Hopkins School of Public Health, so just wanted to put that out there. I wanted to thank Donna for being such an incredible advisor, supporter, first reader, and for bearing with the time difference between us. And last but not least, I wanted to thank my wonderful family and friends for keeping me sane and for dealing with all that comes with me. I know many of you are on this call right now. So my mom, my sisters, my friends, professors, and colleagues who have supported me throughout this journey, thank you so much.
Wonderful job, Selma. That was just amazing. Okay, so I will again start the Q&A. So feel free to use either the chat or you can go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand, any of the above.
I have a question, if I might ask.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Salma what surprised her, if at all, while conducting this research.
Something that really surprised me, honestly, is a lot of our focus group discussion participants were very eager and willing to speak about a lot of the topics that we were asking. And I think that this speaks a lot on how social norms here really do kind of inhibit a woman from being able to speak about these kinds of matters. And so that was honestly like my biggest surprise when doing this and being out in the field.
Mona has her hand raised.
There's
Oh
also
my gosh.
there's a question
I know
in the
that.
chat.
Yep,
Yeah,
I'll get to
okay,
that.
Sorry.
Yep.
We can do the question in the chat first. I just wanted
It's
to say,
okay, Mona, you
Salma.
can go and then I'll go to Amna.
No worries, Salma. Oh my gosh, that was so good. I loved your presentation. It was amazing. Throughout the whole time, something that I was thinking of, I know there was another project that actually ran out of CCP at Hopkins, the Center of Communication Programs, and it was called Mabruk, which translates to congratulations. And it was actually a social behavior change initiative. And I think it ran from 2007 or 2005 to 2006. And it was basically this initiative that looked at promoting interpersonal communication between the wife and husband after marriage, and really talking about family planning, also using like television and other communication challenges or channels to raise awareness. And I'm wondering if across this research that you're doing, if there's anything similar that's still running to this day that you know of that could potentially be impacting your research or anything like that.
I do know that currently in Egypt, there's a national family planning initiative. I'm not entirely sure what its name is. It's like on the top of my head right now. Dr. Zeki might know a bit more about it, but I do know that it's been running for some time now, and it's essentially expanding access to family planning methods. But again, when a method or options are available or accessible, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can act on that if things are seen as taboo or, you know, inappropriate to talk about. And so initiative like Mabruk I feel would be really, really appropriate to apply here in the region. And thank you for that question, Mona. Yeah.
All right, and Amna wants to know, what was the most challenging part of the research process?
I would say on a personal note, I am Egyptian American, but obviously I was born and raised in the States. And so coming back to my home country and kind of, I think that the most difficult part was just being an observer to all of this. So we did end up hiring local data collectors to do all of the work, and I kind of just served as an observer to these focus group discussions. And I think that kind of setting aside all of the preconceived kind of notions that I had about Egypt and everything that was ingrained within me to the side, and just letting, you know, the local data collectors do their work and observing that and learning from the community. I think that was something that was really challenging for me, because I think it's oftentimes difficult to kind of put aside our positionality and kind of let the community lead the way.
Wow. I'm going to take one more question, and Naima, I will give you the floor. And Shannon, I know I see your hand, but maybe you could write it in the text, your question. So Naima, you are free to ask.
Hi, sorry, My mic was muted, but I want to say, Salma, that was such a great presentation. I'm so proud of you. Amna kind of took my question because I wanted to ask about the change in perspective, how if you're born in the States and coming here, even though you're Egyptian American, and, you know, collecting data, how difficult that was, because there's kind of a taboo subject. So that was kind of my question, but you kind of already answered it. So yeah, I'm very proud of you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again, Salma. That was excellent. And now I'm happy to introduce our fourth presenter, Grace Tumwebaze, and she is an MSPH candidate. She went to Portland State University with a Bachelor of Science in Community Health Sciences. And as you can see, the title of her presentation is Barriers to Contraceptive Use Among Adolescent Girls in Sub-Saharan Africa and Insights on How to Address the Barriers. So welcome, Grace.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murray. An amazing job on the presentations. Congratulations. So just to get straight to it, I want to mention that the background and findings are guided by an analysis that I did on secondary peer review literature. Next slide, please, Kristen. So starting with a brief overview. Evidence shows that low contraceptive use increases adolescent pregnancies. And so here I'm starting with a background on adolescent pregnancies. So according to a study by Chola and colleagues, adolescent pregnancies of girls, and these are ages 15 to 19 years old, are growing globally. And these pregnancies are highest in the West, Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa. In addition, these pregnancies, they end up being unintended and early, leading to even more negative health outcomes. And so although use of contraceptive methods is shown to play a role in the reduction of unintended pregnancies, as shown by the literature, sexually active adolescent girls are still not using contraceptive methods or even looking for ways to prevent pregnancies when they need to. Next slide, please. And so that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
It's not going. Hold on.
Okay.
I don't know why it's not advancing. I'm sorry, it's not advancing. Oops. Oh, there we go.
Perfect. And so that leads us to the statement of the problem for my master's essay, which was that there's low use of contraceptive methods, regardless of the need to want to avoid pregnancies among adolescent girls in Sub-Saharan Africa, increasing unintended pregnancies. And so studies also show that low use of contraceptive methods could have negative health outcomes, such as increase in maternal and child mortality, increase in the risk of STIs, and overall unintended pregnancies, which might affect the adolescent girl. So that means they might not be able to finish school, for example. Next slide, please. So the magnitude of the problem here shows that low contraceptive use is a problem and that it should be addressed. So briefly, a study by Chola shows that about 21 million girls between 15 to 19 years old become pregnant, and about 2 million girls younger than 15 also become pregnant in developing regions where low contraceptive use plays a role in the growth of these pregnancies. Also, approximately 49% of these pregnancies are unintended, and about over 50% of them result in unsafe abortions. And so what are some of the barriers to low contraceptive use, and how can we address these barriers? Next slide, please. So a big portion of my master's paper focused on this question of how to address these barriers to contraceptive use. And I aim to answer that question by using the socio-ecological framework. So a brief background on just the socio-ecological framework. It helps to understand how different factors and health issues can be assessed at different levels in order to increase or reduce the health behavior, and provides insights on where and when to intervene. And so for my project, I used this framework, the socio-ecological framework here, that was adopted by Golden and colleagues to assess the causes and determinants of low contraceptive use at the different levels. So here to the right, the socio-ecological framework has 5 levels. You see here the individual level here in the first circle, and then moving upward, the interpersonal, community, policy, and cultural levels. And so in the next few slides, I'll be assessing the barriers, causes, and determinants of low contraceptive use at these different levels. Next slide, please. So the first level we're going to look at here is the individual level to the left, which was the one in blue. Some of the individual level factors here include low levels of education, where lower levels of education reduce contraceptive use, which is a crucial point to note in terms of intervention strategies later. Sex, wealth, where adolescent girls from poor households were shown to use less methods compared to their wealthier counterparts. And age was another individual factor that also reduced contraceptive use. And then next here we had the community level factors, which include rural urban location. So some studies showed that adolescent girls in rural areas were more limited in terms of access to quality contraceptive methods and overall sexual and reproductive health education. And also community and religious leaders reinforce social norms on contraceptive use, and so that led to low use. And this was also shown to be more prevalent in rural areas. And then at the interpersonal level factors and barriers, these included, for example, parents and guardians of adolescent girls might become unaccepting when the girls show sexual desires, and as well as peer groups might not want to associate with adolescent girls who express interest in using contraceptive methods or become pregnant unintended. So all leading up to low contraceptive use. Next slide, please. And then provider and client relationship. This was an interesting finding. It's a cause of low contraceptive use because one of the articles showed that healthcare providers might tell the adolescent girls' parents if they access contraceptive methods. So the lack of consent there just limits adolescent girls from accessing contraceptives. And so which limits adolescent girls from accessing methods altogether. And then at the policy level, this was any strict or lack of empowerment for policymakers on the effectiveness of contraceptive methods, which could increase low use, as well as lack of access to quality contraceptive methods, particularly among rural girls where access might be limited. And then going back to empowering policymakers, and then overall the low funding for contraceptive methods, especially in rural areas, also leads to low use. And then at the cultural level, the social norms as well as religious norms all play a role in low use and overall fear of being stigmatized because of using contraceptive methods limits sexually active girls from using methods as well. So now that we have looked at the different causes and determinants of low contraceptive use, what are some of the strategies future research and program implementers can do to increase contraceptive use? Next slide, please, Kristen. So here are some of the potential solutions that master's essay focused on. First, here to the left, at the individual level, solutions and strategies could include using social media as a contraceptive promotion tool, which has been shown to be an effective approach in terms of reaching youth and adolescents. However, on the other side, for adolescent girls, for example, who might be living in rural areas that might have less access to technology or social media, utilizing health cadres are a form of healthcare workers. So to use them to deliver education messages for girls who live in rural areas is another effective way to deliver these messages. And then including adolescent boys is also key, but interventions should keep in mind ways to promote safe space for adolescent girls to express their sexual desires without feeling shame, for example, if the boys were present. And then at the interpersonal level, parents are protective factors, and so sensitizing them to the importance of adolescent sexual health might also help increase contraceptive use. And then here at the community level, providing equitable resources is key, and using available interventions, particularly those based in rural areas, and have a focus on sexual and reproductive health, can be used to include contraceptive use education, which might improve attendance, especially if adolescents are already utilizing the services, which could lead to more sustainable sexual health education results. And then at the policy level, a potential solution could be to advocate for coverage in rural areas where access to contraceptive methods might be limited, could also help reduce low use. At the cultural level, since research shows that community leaders are trusted in the community, involving them in focus groups with other community members is key. And these focus group discussions can focus on addressing adolescent girls' sexual needs, which will all play a role in increasing contraceptive use. And then lastly, I want to conclude with this slide of, next slide. Yeah, so this slide of specific recommendations. So starting here with, as mentioned previously, using available resources could help. There were different interventions that address contraceptive use. And one of the interventions I came across doing research was called the Gold Circle campaign, and it was actually implemented by CCP here at Johns Hopkins. And the campaign aimed to provide peer education, contraceptive use and sexual health, as well as utilize social media to address low contraceptive use. And so utilizing these already existing interventions or adding on to them to continue to promote sexual health could play a role in increasing adolescent health overall. But also doing program evaluation could help with program efficacy and sustainability. And then a gap in research that was kind of consistent was that there wasn't much mention of adolescent boys, as mentioned previously. And so continuing to involve adolescent boys could help sensitize them to these messages, and they can be more risk averse when engaging in sexual activities. But again, keeping in mind ways to develop these interventions and curriculums in a way that adolescent girls are not pushed further away from the interventions on how the interventions were intended to be. And then finally, including health cadres or community health workers could be also helpful in terms of reaching adolescent girls who might be in rural areas or harder to reach areas, or might not be in school. Could be another way to reduce low contraceptive use. And then overall, in terms of future direction for this work, is hopefully more work and research to look at ways to address adolescent girls' sexual needs by looking more specifically at the different types of contraceptive methods that are widely used or that are not used, could all play a role in improving the health of adolescents. So future work will be more focused on like a specific type of contraception that adolescent girls might show interest in. And then next slide. And then for my acknowledgements, I want to take a moment to thank my support system and people that have been there. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for your patience throughout this whole project from its baby stages to now. Thank you so much for the encouraging words. The PFRH department, thank you for connections to amazing mentors from field placements. I think I saw Dr. Sally here, so thank you. My amazing cohort, thank you, we did it. My friends who made time to be here, I really appreciate you. My family, thank you, Dad. My sisters, Eliza and Linda. Yeah, and my next slide is references. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. That was great. Okay, I will open it up now for Q&A. Gretchen.
Grace, absolutely amazing work.
such an important topic, and you covered it so beautifully. I did have a question. You were mentioning about girls younger than 15 becoming pregnant, although your presentation was mainly focused on those between 15 and 19. Were there any interventions that you found that were done that were impactful for women and girls under the age of 15?
Thank you, Gretchen. That was a great question. So that was actually a gap in research. I think because I never, like you said, I didn't focus on 15 to 19. I think for some of the literature talked about girls being stigmatized for using contraceptive methods, even by their family or friends. So it could make it harder for the young girls to disclose their sexual needs. And so watching the older girls being stigmatized. And so no one is really advocating for the younger girls because they're also not telling anyone because of the fear of stigma. And so that's one of my thinking, but I think there is research out there. I think that could be like another future step to like focus on like younger girls and their sexual needs and how that looks like. But yeah, that was definitely a gap that I found in my research. Thank you, great question.
Okay, and if just to let you know, the Global Adolescent Study does have some articles on that, so you can check out on our website. But Amna does have a question.
Yes, again, wonderful job, Grace. It was really interesting to learn about how you use the socio-ecological framework to guide your findings. So one question I have is, what was your process in deciding to use this framework?
Yeah, great question. So the framework overall helps to understand factors and how to intervene. So based off of just that overall goal of the framework, I thought it would be helpful to use that framework in terms of like realizing like the different factors and like knowing how to intervene pretty much. I feel like I'm going in circles, but I think also in terms of future like program implementation, like for example, guiding a researcher not to just go in and be like, this is what you should do. I think the framework guides you in terms of like finding out what the factors are. For example, at the cultural level, like doing focus groups or doing qualitative interviews, and then finding ways to like intervene at that level that way. So the framework guides for a researcher or whoever is implementing a program to intervene in a way that doesn't further stigmatize community members. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. Okay.
Just giving you the thumbs up. So
Awesome.
Great. Well, I'm going to move on, but thank you so much, Grace. This was a wonderful job. And now I'm going to welcome our last presenter for the day, and that is Kelsey Williams. She is an MSPH candidate, and she graduated from Tulane University with a BS in Public Health. And as you can see here, the title of her presentation is called Machine Learning and Predictive Analytics for Children's Public Health and Social Services Using Administrative Data, a Scoping Review. So welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction, Kristen, and congratulations to all the presenters who have gone before me. This has been a great day. So I will just jump right into it. Also, y'all are seeing just the slides, yes? No notes, okay, great. So in this presentation, I will cover an explanation of machine learning predictive analytics. I'll summarize some of the challenges of using this methodology with administrative data. I'll present the findings from my scoping review and discuss the implications for the future. So most people are familiar with machine learning in more commercial contexts. Companies like Google and Facebook use machine learning to predict our moods, preferences, and consumer behaviors and sell that information for marketing. Machine learning is important to automation technologies like self-driving cars and robotic assembly lines. Machine learning technologies have also slowly entered healthcare as a part of precision medicine. For example, in pediatric healthcare, researchers use machine learning with electronic health records to predict things like mortality in neonatal intensive care or what drug therapies might work for a specific child. So this begs the question, can health and social services organizations use machine learning and the administrative data they collect from our interactions with agencies and providers for social good to predict and tailor services to better meet the needs of families with young children? Precision public health and social services are defined by one scholar as delivering the right intervention to the right population at the right time, and that includes considerations of social and environmental determinants of health. So a bit more about how machine learning works. In essence, researchers present one or more algorithms with a large data set. The algorithm uses a variety of methods, such as decision trees, regression methods, clustering methods, or others, to learn by repeatedly analyzing the data and identifying patterns. Then the algorithm uses those patterns to predict future outcomes from novel data. Because of the requirement for a high volume of data, administrative data can be a really good candidate for use in machine learning predictive analytics because it can be less costly to obtain than data collected exclusively for research, such as survey data or cohort study data. Administrative data is data collected by organizations during the usual process of their operations. So this data might inform service delivery, it might track or monitor progress of clients, it might be used for continuous quality improvement. It's the type of thing kept in a management information system database. In the case of children's public health and social services, examples might include indicators on socio-demographic characteristics or on services received as a part of participation in programs like WIC or Head Start or foster care. There are a number of challenges with machine learning predictive analytics, especially when it's paired with administrative data. If models are trained on biased data, they will learn and replicate these biases in prediction. This can be an ethical problem when, for instance, according to one scholar, historical over-surveillance and over-policing of poor communities and communities of color means that those groups are disproportionately represented in child welfare or criminal justice data sets. And then algorithms are trained on these biased data sets and are more likely to rate individuals coming from these communities as higher risk. Machine learning models have also been criticized for being non-transparent. So they make it difficult to interpret the results and understand how predictions are made, especially if you're not a statistical expert. Tolerance for error is a serious concern. We have to ask who gets to decide what's an acceptable level of false positives or false negatives, especially for sensitive topics like substantiating child maltreatment. Administrative data can have the same problems as any data set, but it's often more susceptible because service providers are really busy with tons of other responsibilities, and they don't think they're collecting it for research. So it's less important that they think it's less important that it's accurate. There may be systematic or random missingness and clerical errors that lead to inaccuracies. So despite the important ethical and methodological concerns, machine learning predictive analytics holds enormous potential for use in children's public health and social services. It may be used to assess risk more accurately, assist in decision-making for service provision, learn which clients to attract and how to retain them in social services programs, and to forecast outcomes. There have been other scoping reviews of machine learning applications in other similar settings and services. And given increasing interest in using these methods within children's public health and social services, more information is needed on whether and how they're already being used. So the aim of this scoping review was to summarize the literature on uses of machine learning predictive analytics with administrative data in non-medical settings to support children's public health and social services. I used the Arsky and O'Malley framework to guide this scoping review. I consulted with the library informationist to identify relevant databases and search terms within the concepts that make up this topic. As you can see in this Prisma diagram, I initially screened 451 articles, but my final group only identified 13 studies that met all of my inclusion criteria. Important inclusion criteria to note are that the studies needed to focus on children under 9 years old, which is the WHO definition of child. They needed to be published after the Affordable Care Act was passed, so after 2010, and needed to be peer-reviewed articles with empirical results. So here are some of the study characteristics. Of the 13 studies I reviewed, 11 were published since 2018. The majority of studies were on child welfare topics and 3 were on lead poisoning. Data were mostly from the United States, although sometimes they were analyzed by researchers outside the United States. And a few studies had data from China and New Zealand. There were a variety of administrative data sources, the most common being departments of health, state and county departments of human services, public school systems, federal, state, and local water boards, and the US Census Bureau. The number of records used to develop models really ranged from 352 to over 200,000. And most studies used over 10,000 records to feed into their models. So what do these studies do exactly? Here are two good examples. One used water chemistry data, socioeconomic information, and spatial features to train and test models to estimate the likelihood of lead-contaminated tap water in over 8,000 schools across California and Massachusetts. Another developed a model to estimate the likelihood of substantiated maltreatment among children enrolled in New Zealand's public benefit system and explored prevention and early intervention services for families identified. The studies made a variety of types of predictions. 9 made individual level predictions to do things like determine individual risk, assist in informing service delivery, and 1 even predicted the location of missing children. The other 4 studies made aggregate predictions at the community, school, or legislative level. And studies also engaged across primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Across all studies, there were 14 types of algorithms that were used, and they're all listed here. 6 studies used more than 1 machine learning algorithm and compared them, and 7 studies presented the results from only 1 machine learning algorithm, but spent more time describing the model development. The algorithms most frequently used that you can see here were random forests, followed by logistic regression, which is different than traditional statistics, logistic regression, and neural networks. And then they became less common as you move up. Studies used a variety of metrics to report the performance of their models, including area under the receiver operating characteristic curve, sensitivity, specificity, and a bunch of others. All studies included in this review reported that a machine learning algorithm was at least somewhat successful at prediction. 3 cases where they were the most successful are presented in this table. So LGINS, which is the center row, the model predicted the probability that US foster care children would achieve legal permanency and was the most successful, followed by Bruch et al.'s model that identified at-risk students using in-school and out-of-school variables, and Lobo et al.'s prediction that about whether there would be elevated child blood levels at the zip code level. So what did we learn from this scoping review? Articles that used more data often had better prediction. That's not really that surprising. Some studies like Elgin used a bunch of, like a large number of records and tested a bunch of different algorithms to see which made the best prediction. As you can see in this slide, these top performing models really tried out a lot of different types of algorithms. That's the center column. Other authors didn't have as many observations, but they linked data sources so that each observation had over 100 variables each, and that ended up leading to a large volume of data. This suggests that machine learning predictive analytics methods are probably best for large programs that produce extensive administrative data. One thing authors didn't address was how machine learning predictive analytics worked in comparison with traditional statistics, which really would have been interesting because they are different, but they can serve the same purpose. These studies came from a diversity of fields and were published quite recently, which points to the fact that this is a really emerging set of tools with a wide range of applications. And lastly, even though the inclusion criteria were narrow, it was surprising that the scoping review only had 13 studies. A scoping review of machine learning in pediatric medicine that I modeled this review off had 363 articles. And this really made me wonder if using non-medical administrative data, so social services and public health data, is a new frontier with a lot of promise, or if a lot of people have tried it and it's just too cumbersome to be practical and there are unpublished results. The studies in this review had some common limitations. They seem to use all the data available to them, which is good, but they didn't do sample size calculations, which are still necessary with machine learning. Generalizability was a concern. Machine learning predictive analytics method models continue to learn over time by analyzing new data that's fed into them. So they need to be continuously validated over time. It can't just be a point in time validation. Additionally, if the validation data comes from the same source as the training data, so if it's just a small set that's withheld, there might be a persistent underlying bias that's then replicated in prediction. So models really need to be validated on external data sets. 7 of the 13 studies reviewed in this article mentioned a limitation of administrative data. such as error or systematic missingness or difficulty accessing data sets. And finally, authors in a different 7 of 13 studies raised ethical concerns similar to what I discussed earlier, particularly of concerns that they were going to reinforce discriminatory practices or racial bias in some way. Clearly, experts in the public need to discuss ways in which we are comfortable with our data being used, both for machine learning predictive analytics in these types of settings, but also beyond. And I'm sure some of you have heard those public conversations happening. Slide is happening. There we go. So there were several limitations to this review. Firstly, I used strict inclusion criteria, and researchers hoping to learn about the breadth of research questions that machine learning predictive analytics can answer might want to look beyond the studies that use just administrative data, because there's a lot of interesting stuff out there. Secondly, it is impossible to include terms in the search strategy for every possible source of administrative data, so I might have missed some articles, especially because this was a global search. And lastly, I'm really new to this topic, and while I think that it is fascinating and will continue to be important, and I hope to do more work on it, my current understanding may have limited my analysis. So thank you so much to Dr. West. You have been an incredible mentor, and I have learned so much from you. Thank you for also sticking with me through this process, including a complete pivot mid-semester. Dr. Moreau, thank you for being such a helpful and supportive advisor. Thank you to my brilliant cohort who have also made this master's experience immeasurably more fun. And finally, thanks to my partner, Matt. I do my best thinking out loud. So in addition to being a loving and supportive partner, he really helped me brainstorm a lot of the formative thinking that went into this scoping review. And with that, I will take any questions.
Great job, Kelsey. Really, really interesting. Okay, so I see Haley, your hand up first.
Yeah, I just want to say congratulations. I know it was a heavy lift to shift midway, but watching you get this work done has been incredible, and I feel very proud to be your friend. Machine learning algorithms is above my head. I'm not familiar with that, so I won't ask a question about that, but I will ask about types of data. So I know you used administrative data for this review. And I was just wondering if there are other studies that explore machine learning prediction with other types of data. Is that new? Is that something you've thought about? Anything in that general area of question?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really good question, kind of something that I addressed at the end, that people interested in this might want to look beyond administrative data. Some that I kind of identified and ultimately excluded from my review that were super interesting. One used DHS data to classify the likelihood that children would be experiencing undernutrition in Ethiopia, I think, based on sociodemographic information. There was one that used like survey data on where people get food, where adults purchase their food, to predict patterns of child undernutrition in the United States. There was one that used social media data to predict whether children would be immunized or not, so to predict adults who would be anti-vaxxers and to think about targeting solutions towards them. So yeah, there have been a number of really interesting other studies that use like survey data or social media data, or like not strictly administrative data, that answer a lot of super interesting questions. So thanks for that.
Great. And I see in the chat, Sylvia raised a question. Such interesting methodology and work. I was wondering how you would recommend bridging some of the challenges of MLPA, and if there's any examples for using MLPA in medical settings.
Yeah, there's actually a lot more examples of using machine learning predictive analytics in medical settings. Basically anything that falls in the category of precision medicine probably used electronic health records, which are technically administrative data, but one of my exclusion criteria was that studies couldn't exclusively use EHRs for this, and that was because most of that is medical studies. But like machine learning is a really great way to process huge sources of data. So genetic studies that predict if there's a locus on a gene that would be particularly susceptible to treatment might use machine learning. There's a lot of machine learning that goes into risk of hospital readmission, a whole host of things. So, and electronic health records are a lot easier to use than like program's administrative data, because medical providers are both a little bit better at inputting it for billing purposes, and also some of those health management information systems are really high tech. Like if you think about Epic, so they bridge some of the problems really well. The question is bridging those problems with less advanced types of administrative data.
Mm-hmm. Great. Teresa, I'll take your last question from you.
Okay, great, thanks. I was wondering if any of the studies address the problems of overfitting, because obviously one of the advantages of machine learning is that it's very flexible, but then as you sort of touched on, that can create problems with generalizability down the line.
Yeah, some of them did, and even more that I ended up excluding, but did read the full text of, addressed overfitting. They often looked at different algorithms, and they would exclude algorithms that were overfitting too poorly if they validated on an external data set, or overfitting too much. Also, sometimes they would kind of like reduce the variables and see sort of what the most influential variables were, if there was too much collinearity, and do all the things you would do if you were using traditional statistics to try to eliminate that problem. But yes, it is an issue, and it would be interesting if they addressed it a little bit more in their method sections.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kelsey. Wonderful job. Really interesting. All of you, I want to just do another hands up to all the presenters today. You all did a fabulous job. I want to thank the readers, the advisors that were behind the scenes, and thank you for all your guidance. And then especially I'd like to give another shout out to Kristen McCormick for all of her work. So thank you all, and we will again meet next week for our final 2 rounds of master's presentations, Tuesday and Wednesday. All right, everyone, have a good day.